So maybe just to go a little more detail about the Alberta Carbon Trunkline. The Alberta Carbon Trunkline Project is more than just a pipeline. It's a fully integrated carbon capture, compression, transportation, and storage project. The partners in the project will have over $1 billion invested by the end of this year, when we expect to start injecting up to 5,000 tons a day as our initial target. It will be, at that time, the world's largest capacity system totally dedicated to anthropogenic or man-made CO2. So the partners in the project include the CO2 suppliers. That's the Northwest Sturgeon Refinery. That's our large supplier. We expect about 3,500 tons a day from there. We have Nutrien, a fertilizer facility just right beside the refinery, that we expect another 800 tons. And at that point, Enhance actually acquires that CO2 from those parties. We hand the CO2 off to a company called Wolf Carbon Solutions. They're a new partner in the project. We brought them in about a year ago. They're a midstream service provider. They essentially provide compression and transportation services to Enhance. On a fee-for-service basis, they compress and transport our CO2 down the pipeline to deliver it to us at Clive. And the other partners in the project include the Alberta government under a 2010 funding program that also funded part of the Quest project, and also the federal government has been in under a couple other grant programs since about 2010. The government funding allowed us to build this system with a lot of excess capacity, essentially allowed us to build the Highway 2 of CO2 in Alberta, hopefully with an opportunity for future growth. So just in perspective, 5,000 tons a day, what does that mean? It's a lot of CO2. If you think of atmospheric CO2, it's 325 blimpfuls of CO2 every day going into the ground. If you look at the pipeline pressure, we move it in liquid form at over 2,000 pounds. That's about 150 truckfuls of liquid CO2, and it's equivalent to taking about 325,000 cars off the road every day. On a global basis, if you think of where carbon capture and storage is, there's about 18 projects exist today globally. They put about 40 megatons a year into the ground. This graph, on the left side of the graph, are the existing projects. The size of the bubbles represent the capacity of those projects, and on the vertical axis, you're essentially looking at the sources, whether it's from hydrogen or whether it's from synthetic gas or natural gas processing or fertilizer. And on the right-hand side, you've got the projects that are in development. There's about 20 projects in development, including ours, which is almost ready to start up. And if you look at the IPCC report in terms of what it thinks we need in terms of to develop for carbon capture, we'd need to do about 2,500 projects between now and 2040, about the size of phase 1 of ACTL. So it's a big task ahead of us. That's about 100 projects like ACTL every year for 20 years. So even though CCS is really the only current technology that can eliminate fossil fuel emissions, and it's the only existing proven technology that can decarbonize cement or steel or coal or fertilizer, there's still the commercial reality that there's no revenue derived from straight carbon capture and storage, and the current price on carbon isn't sufficient to justify the cost of capture. There's a gap there. So what you need to do is find other revenue sources, to contribute to the cost of capture. So in our case, we chose to use CO2 EOR. So we generate revenue from the sale of oil, and that helps pay for the cost of capture. So a little bit about EOR. CO2 EOR has actually been around for a long time. It's been done in the US for over 45 years, and we've got a couple fields in Canada that have been going for well over 20. There's been over 135 successful EOR projects in the States. Down there, they got a lot of their experience with natural occurring CO2. They drilled for it, they found it, so it wasn't an emissions offset project, it was just an oil recovery effort. And if you look at the CCS projects today in North America, the ones on the prior graph with the bubbles, 80% of the ones in North America actually use EOR in their storage strategy. So one of the common questions I get is how much of the CO2 we put in the ground is going to stay? It's a pretty simple answer. It all does. As we inject the CO2, it starts going down an injection well and starts to move oil through the rock. And at the producing wells, we're going to produce oil, CO2, and water. We bring it to the surface, we separate, send the oil to market. But we take the CO2 and the water, we immediately recycle back in the ground. We produce for 20, 30 years. At the end of the day, at economic limit, we shut the production in, we shut the injection in, and every ton we bought off ACTL stays in the ground. So it truly is a permanent sequestration of every ton that we purchase and move down ACTL. We end up producing a low-carbon oil product on a net basis, and if you think of our motivation, we're actually economically motivated to make the most oil we can out of the least amount of CO2. So if you look at the best floods in North America, they would consume about, or they would sequester about 50 grams of CO2 for every megajoule of energy they produce in oil. And that could be substantially higher if you're either not as successful, or if there's a higher price on carbon or the price of oil increases, you can economically go a lot further than that. But if you take that 50 number as kind of the set point, and that's essentially the carbon offset we get. And then if you look at what it takes to produce oil, we've got CO2 emitted from production. We've got CO2 emitted as we consume that barrel. So where we end up on the high side is about a CO2 net intensity impact of about 50% of that of natural gas and about 40% of that of the typical average barrel in Alberta. And depending on the economics of the day, it could actually be carbon zero. So we truly produce a low carbon energy product. Now I'd just like to quickly show you some of the activity out there. It's a pretty exciting time for folks in our company. Some of them have been around for the full 10-year duration trying to get this project underway. It's had lots of bumps in the road and delays, but we're here now within a couple weeks of putting first CO2 into the pipeline. So this first picture is just a shot of the nutrient compression facility. It sits right across the railroad track from the fertilizer plant that's been producing and venting CO2 for over 40 years. So at this site, we have about 800 tons of CO2 coming in. We have about 8,000 horsepower compression. We extract about 3,000 barrels a day of water. We run a dry system to keep the CO2 non-corrosive. Next picture is the compression related to the Sturgeon refinery. This is a facility that's going to compress about 3,500 tons of CO2. There's about 15,000 horsepower on this site, and we take CO2 from the refinery pressure up to about pipeline pressure of about 2,500 pounds max. The pipeline itself, and these facilities are all owned and operated by Wolf as a midstream provider of services. This next shot is just a picture of the pipeline. You don't see many of these. This pipeline they first hit the field last October. We're sitting here in less than a year, completed construction on a 240-kilometer, 16-inch diameter pipeline through one of the wettest years we've ever had. So kudos to those guys. They did a great job, and we're close to starting up. Then when we get to Clive, we've got the enhanced oil recovery operations here. We're going to initially develop a pool, a Leduc D3 pool in the Clive field. It sits about 15 miles just east of Lacombe. This field's been on production for over 50 years. It's produced hundreds of millions of barrels of oil and water and over its life. We've got very good information. We know the reservoir very well. We've got good well delineation. We've got production and pressure history. So we're very high confidence in where the CO2 is going to go. About half the oil that was originally in the reservoir is remaining. We expect to recover a significant piece of that. Just a couple shots of our activity out on the enhanced oil recovery. So we started our development of this field early in the year. This picture first is a shot of our first injection well. We drill all our wells from existing pads, minimizing environmental impacts. We use horizontal technology so that we can locate our surfaces on existing sites. This next picture is just a shot of our existing central facility. It's a typical facility you might find that's, again, handled water and oil and natural gas for a long time. And you can see on the picture on the left, you can see the right away from the Alberta Carbon Trunkline coming in from the north. There's a clear area on that left-hand picture, and on the right picture is our current picture shot of the modules we had to add to handle the CO2 separation and the CO2 compression. We have to, when we come to surface, we have to separate and, of course, recycle everything back in the ground. Again, it makes efficient use of an existing footprint. Had to build some new gathering system. We run 3 lines down the center of our field. We essentially have a big emulsion line, poly line, because we're bringing in wet CO2, and then we'd have a water injection line and a CO2 injection line in the same ditch, again, for efficiency. And we try and follow existing right-of-ways, again, to the extent we can. So really, we think Alberta is sitting here today with an excellent opportunity. Even though there's challenges and barriers to wide-scale mass deployment, we've got a cost gap yet. Alberta sits here with large single-point source emissions, 150 megatons a year going into the air. We've got experience with enhanced oil recovery, and we've got experience with CCS. We sit on top of the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. There's countries in the world that would like to do this, that have point source emissions, but they don't sit on a basin. They have to pipeline it to the coast and put it on a ship and take it to the North Sea to put it in the ground. We have regulatory regime operating-wise that regulate how we drill and operate and control and measure and monitor. We can do it safely. We have a public that understands what we do. Today we have 17,000 wells in the province that are injecting some kind of fluid in the ground, either for storage or for permanent sequestration. So we know what we're doing there, and I think a lot of countries wish they had our spot. I think it's our opportunity to lose. Enhance intends to continue to try and work on those barriers, trying to close that cost gap, and we like to be a key part of the low carbon solution if we can. Thanks for your time.